Okay, so in this first card that I'm going to create, I'll hold the image up to the camera for you. It's a beautiful heart in the centre and a little girl's legs or a lady's legs underneath, so it's quite a sweet one. I'm going to begin by mixing my colours, so a little bit of water on the palette, a couple of different areas. So I'm going to begin by working on the heart. Just take a number 4 round brush, and I have some permanent rose, and I'm going to mix up a nice pale shade of permanent rose in my palette. Let's show you on a tester strip how pale that is. Okay, nice and fluid as well, quite a bit of water, because we're going to do a cling film technique. Use it as a resist so that we get some lovely texture on the heart. So the second colour I'm going to mix up is crimson, alizarin crimson, so much redder than the pink. It's got a little bit of blue in there as well. I want this one to be a little bit thicker, a little bit stronger. So just mixing that colour up in my palette. Again, giving it a bit of a test. So there's a nice difference in colour tone changing between the pink and the red. Okay, so the way we go about this, folks, is first of all we need to wet the heart with some clean water. So remember, I've got 2 pots of water here, one for clean for mixing and wetting and one for washing my brush. So I'm just going to take my bigger brush, this one's a number 8 round, and I'm just wetting that whole heart area, trying to stay within the lines, because this is how you control where the paint goes. Anywhere that's wet, the paint will want to run into that area. Anywhere that's dry won't, it'll stop the paint from moving into that area. So this is how we can control the paint nice and easily in this technique. So I've got a bit of water on the surface. I don't want any puddles. So I'm just spreading it around, making sure it touches the edges of the heart I've drawn. Okay, and now I'm going to take back to my number 4 brush, and I'm going to go into the pink first. And I'm going to dot down some areas of pink. Bringing it to the edge of the heart. Doesn't matter if you go over the edge of the lines, it's absolutely fine. So this is a really good one for beginners. So lovely and pink at the top of the heart. Clean off my brush into that rich crimson, and I'm going to come in towards the bottom of the heart. Just taking care along that edge, and you can see that the paint wants to move about into the water that's on the surface. And I'm going to drag some of that red up into the pink that I just painted so that they blend together. And the same on this edge as well. So you could actually leave it like this, just have the 2 colours on there, just gently blending. But what I'm going to do next, I'm just going to get a bit of the pink on my brush straight from my palette so it's a bit stronger. Just popping that at the top there, just to get a stronger sense of that pink. It's actually permanent rose I've got there. And now what I want to do is get my cling film, so it's already been cut and it's ready to go. And I'm going to scrunch it a little bit, and then I'm going to place it down on the surface of the paper, and I'm pressing down into that paint and pressing it, and you can see that it creates shapes and lines. And what you have to do is leave this to completely dry. So if I just show you what I've got now, keep the painting flat because it's wet and you don't want that to move around the surface, but you can see that there's some lovely patterns happening there. So I'm going to let that completely dry and come back in a few, probably half an hour, and we can continue with this. Okay, so it's been about 45 minutes and my heart is now dry. So I've simply peeled away the cling film, so you can put that to one side, you don't need that anymore. And if I hold this up to the camera, you should be able to see the beautiful textures that are running across that heart now. So that's perfect. And actually you can see that it's run across some of the edges. So first of all, what my job now is to tackle those by wetting my brush. Just move that out of the way. And just looking at the edges using that wet brush, clean paper towel, dab away any of those, rub and dab, that's the technique. So rub with your bristles left and right, press really quite firmly with the paper towel to lift away any paint that may have sort of seeped out from beneath that cling film. So you might have quite a lot or you might not have any. Good job if you haven't. You must have been much more careful than me. So that's pretty much done the trick. There's one or two other areas, but I'm going to carry on now and show you what to do next. So I'm going to paint in her lovely little legs, and I've decided that I think Payne's grey is the way to go here. So I'm going to give her some stripes. I'm going to give her, with this Payne's grey, I want it nice and thick so that it stands out. I'm using my number 4 round brush, and I'm going to paint in some stripy tights. So here goes. So if you give a slight curve to each stripe, that gives the girl some shape to her legs. There we go, just a tiny bit more water. It's not coming off my brush very easily, so just wetting it a bit more, putting in some more paint. And if you turn your brush around in the palette, it will bring the point back to the tip of your brush. So again, just moving down, take your time. Trying to keep my stripes the same sort of distance apart and the same thickness. And then again on the foot, just going to make them a little bit thinner. Okay, so those are the tights done, and next I'm going to paint in the arms. I've kept the hands really simple, they're just like little, there's no fingers on the hands, it's like a little mitten, just to make things nice and simple. So I like to use a little bit of my, not cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, and I think I'm going to use some of the burnt sienna. And show you what I get there. So a sort of a pale brown colour, and then just fill in the arms. So we've got the arms in there. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. This one's a number 2 round, and I'm going to use the crimson red. Just mix it up a little bit. dab off a little bit of the paint on a piece of paper towel so you haven't got too much on there, because these shoes and the little strap on the ankle are very, very small, so you don't want to go in with a huge amount of paint and end up with a big blob. So to control it, if you take off a bit of excess paint before you start, it won't all rush off and create that blob. So we've got an ankle strap and little red shoes. Lovely. And then I'm going to give her a little red dress as well. So as long as the arms are dry, which they are, we can go in and paint the dress without the two colours running together. So I'm using that same brush, so it's nice and small. I can get to the corners of the dress easily. And drag that paint around. Bit too much on my brush there, so just dabbing it off. So the paint now that I've got on the paper, I've got enough to fill the rest of the space, I think. So just dabbing off the excess allows me to control the paint a little bit easier. Need a tiny bit more. Giving you a little flick there, the corner of the skirt. Just going to, I've popped my hand in that shoe, so I'm just going to dab that pink off while I can. There we go. And there we have it. Beautiful card with a little girl holding a huge heart. Hope you've enjoyed that one. Okay, so the second card that I'm going to do for you guys today is a really sweet little gnome holding a balloon heart, which I think is dead cute. So let's get started on that. I already have some permanent rose and crimson in my palette. I'm going to use those as well as a little bit of Payne's grey. So the first step, once you've drawn your image onto your watercolour paper, you can decide what colours you want to do. I'm going to keep mine nice and simple. Going back to my number 4 brush, I'm going to give him a lovely stripy hat, and I'm going to begin with the pale pink. So that one's the permanent rose, and I'm going to go straight in and paint in that first stripe of his hat. So straight in with that pink. And if you want a little bit of definition, maybe some light and shade, you can go into the permanent rose on your palette that's from the solid palette, if you like, and just dab in at the corners, and that will give you some slightly darker spots and make it look a little bit more sort of three-dimensional. So if you do that while the paint is still wet or damp, then it'll blend in nicely across the surface of his hat. Okay, and then I'm going to continue with alternate stripes with this pale pink, and I'm going to let those dry before I paint the other stripes, because obviously if I were to do this stripe now, it would bleed in. The wet paint would touch each other and you'd get colours running together. So to keep it nice and crisp, I'm going to do the two colours and the stripes separately. You can do whatever colours you like. You might want to go kind of blues and greys, might be nice. And depending on who your card's for, the person might have particular favourite colours. You could go with that. That would be, I'm sure they'd appreciate that if you know their preferences for colour. And you keep going in this way until you've filled up all those stripes. Okay, so while that pink is drying, it's still not completely dry, so rather than going in and spoiling what I've done, I'm going to move on to another section. So my heart balloon, I want to use the crimson colour. So I have already tested the crimson on a piece of paper. You can see that it's a lovely strong colour, and I'm going to just paint that in. Nice and strong at the top, then clean my brush, dab off that excess water, put some clean water on my brush, and then drag that paint down to the bottom of the balloon. So you can see it's sort of paler at the bottom. Okay, oops, I've just popped my hand in that. Let's rectify that section there. So just lifting the paint with a clean damp brush. You can scrub away at any edges that have splayed, or if you've gone over some lines. Just take a clean brush with a little bit of water, rub away at that, and then press out with some clean paper towel, and it will lift right off. So obviously I was working in this top left corner there, and I've popped my hand down in there, which is not good actually. And I'm going to lift out that same technique. I'm going to lift out some of this red. It's drawn its way down. So my paper towel here, all I'm doing is with my wet brush just dragging off some of that paint. It's still slightly damp, so it's lifting nicely, but can you see it gives us some definition on that balloon. And if you wipe off the excess paint on your paper towel, then that works quite nicely. Just pop a little bit more on this side, a little bit more of the crimson, bring that crimson down. There we go. Okay, so I think my hat is dry enough at the bottom to start the second colour, and I'm going to go with something different to the pink. I want to make a slightly purple colour. So actually I'm going to take my brush, take some of my dark blue in my palette, which is Ultramarine, and add that to the pink that I already used, a little bit more. And let's show you how that looks on a tester piece. Okay, so that's how that purple is looking. I think it's a little bit pale, so I'm going to go for a bit more blue in there. And let's have a look now. So that is better, that is much better. So you can see this is much more pink, this has got slightly more blue tinge to the purple that I was after. And same brush, I've not changed brushes, just going to paint up to the edges of the pink that I put down previously, starting along the top and working my way down. And to get in the little areas, just use the tip of your brush so that you can get into those corners. So less pressure on your brush and you'll be able to do it nice and neatly. And I'm just going to move up in exactly the same way. Final little section, just there. Lovely. Okay, so that's the hat painted, and next I want to look at his beard, because this is, you know, quite a large area on this painting. I'm just going to use Payne's grey Just getting a little bit of clean water on my palette, tiny bit of Payne's grey in there. So we've got a really pale, again, let me do a tester for you. So you can see that that's nice and pale. And what I aim to do is just to come in at the edges of his beard first of all, painting it little tiny brush strokes, flicking the brush. And then I'm going to do these little flicky effects with the tip, again with just the tip of my brush, so there's not a lot of pressure, just running it underneath the hat there for some shadow. But then painting hair, you want to definitely leave highlights. You don't want a solid block of grey, you want it to look textured. So if I show you on a little tester here, I'm going to show you in red so you can see it clearly. So if I just take some crimson on my brush. So to paint hair, you want to be using little flicky techniques, strokes, in different directions and overlapping, slightly different shapes, different lengths of stroke to build up that hair. And hopefully that way you won't end up with a flat surface. So if I go back to my Payne's grey, a little bit more water, there we go. And you can switch up your brush if you want, if you're not confident with painting hair. A smaller brush would be better. So I have a number 2 here, you could have a go with that, or even finer if you're, if you're really concerned. Just maybe have a go on a tester strip as well. But I'm just painting in a flicky motion, and the hair is falling down. So you don't want your hairs to go left and right, you want them to be vertical, but not stripy. So my gnome has got kind of wavy hair, which is slightly easier to paint. So these little strokes are coming in now. Just wetting this down even further, adding more water and getting a paler grey. And it's starting to come together nicely. And again, the bottom, it's kind of a rough edge. I've not done a straight line at the bottom of the hair. I've kind of cut into it and kind of put wavy marks in there. And what you can do is you can build this up so you can have some slightly darker grey, or do a second layer at the top where there's a shadow, obviously beneath that hat. Needs to be a little darker. And then as you get further down, it can lighten up a little bit. So if I just show you closer on the camera what we've got, you can see that there's a variation of shade and light and lots of texture. Okay. Right, so thinking about his hand, his nose, he's got a bit of an arm here. I think what I'm going to do is stick with this purple for his sleeve and just get that in. So I already had some mixed from before, so that's the Ultramarine Blue and the Permanent Rose, which makes this lovely purple colour. Okay, and for his hand and his nose, I'm going to create a sort of a skin type tone, I suppose you could call it. I'm going to begin with yellow ochre. Oops, got a hair on my palette there. A little bit of yellow ochre, I think. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of the crimson, which is really strong, so just do a little bit of crimson and it'll give you a kind of a peachy sort of colour. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with his peachy nose. So I've painted it entirely in that one tone. And now what I'm going to do, clean my brush, and I'm going to lift out a section here to give his nose a highlight. Okay, so he has a little highlight patch on his nose there. And I'm going to paint exactly the same way for his hand. So I've done him like a little mitten, rather than painting fingers and things like that, because these gnomes are very basic, aren't they? And they're really popular at the moment. They're everywhere you go, you see them everywhere. So I thought this would be really appropriate for this year's Valentine's card. Now his little boots at the bottom, let's go brown. Let's just go traditional brown for that. So I have a burnt sienna in my palette. Just get a little bit of that. It's very kind of a warm brown. So let's go ahead and paint that on his boots. I'm going to use that for the leather top part of his boot on both sides. Do this as quickly as I can for you guys. Obviously you can take your time. Okay, so the same technique again. I want a little bit of a light reflecting on the top of his boot here, and then the same here. Just a little light patch. And then for underneath, I'm just going to add a little bit of my Payne's grey to that burnt sienna. Oops, perhaps went a bit too far with that. There we go. So this time it's a darker brown. So just by adding a bit more of the Payne's grey to my burnt sienna, and then dragging that along the bottom there of his little boot. Great. And I also want to pop in the line of the string that's attached to the balloon. So I'm going to use my little brush, my number 4 round brush, and painting really lightly. If you use your finger as a guide, rest that, and then if you use the very tip of your brush standing on its end, you can get some nice fine lines. As soon as you put any pressure down, it gives you a thick line. So you want to be as light as you can with this. So some people find this quite tricky at first. So I'm going to drag the tip of the brush using my finger as a sort of a way of holding my arm at the same distance from the page, and then coming down. There we go. Let's go around and give it a little tie as well. Okay. Lovely. And then finally, his little bubbly bit on his hat, just some little lines that resemble strokes that we did for his beard, just around those edges to make it look fluffy. Okay, and there we have it. That's our gnome completed. So for card number 3, I've simply drawn the outline of a heart, and we're going to use a little bit of table salt in this particular one. I thought that might be fun. So on my palette, I'm going to mix up down here some of the Ultramarine Blue. I'm going to try and get really nice deep blue, and we're using the salt actually on the background. Okay, so need to mix enough to entirely fill that space. So I'm going in with some more paint. I want to make sure I've got a nice strong blue. So what do we have at the moment? Okay, so it's not too bad, but I want it stronger. So more paint in that blue. And actually I am going to strengthen it, darken it by adding some of this crimson that's already on my palette. So I'm soaking up some of the crimson, mixing it with that blue. I'm going to do the same again. Let's get some more of that crimson, mix it in with that blue. Now that should have given us, yes, see how that is slightly darker? So I'm happy with that. And of course you can use whatever colour you like. Now I'm going to work around the piece sort of methodically. So I'm going to start in this top corner. So let's give myself some space. And I'm going to switch brushes to a bigger brush. This one is my number 8 brush. And I'm going to paint. I'm going to paint, I don't want a perfect edge to this. So I'm going to give myself like a sort of a jagged border, because I think that might be nice. Again, something a little bit different. So I've popped in that paint. I'm going to work it down towards the heart. And again, even though I've got a big brush, I can control the tip of the brush and draw quite easily around the edge of that heart. Okay. And continue down this left hand side, dragging the paint down as I go. Again, remembering to leave a bit of a scruffy edge. I like that word, scruffy. Let's go with that, scruffy edge. Okay. Nice and tidy up at the edge of the heart. Don't know why I said rose there. Must have roses on the brain. And just tidying up while I can see some little edges that aren't quite right here. So just tidying those up. And I've got to this point, and what I'm going to do now is it's just beginning to dry. So I'm going to take a pinch of the table salt and I'm going to sprinkle little bits into the surface of that paint. Okay, and then continue painting. Going to go up the right hand side now with this blue. Might need to mix a little bit more actually. So a little bit more salt now, last little bit of salt in this top area. And what that will do is it will disguise a bit of that line that we have here. Just dab out that last bit I popped down because that was silly of me, painting directly over dry paint. And that's an easy way of getting a hard line. So now the salt is down, it's already beginning to work. If I hold that up to you, you can see there. It's almost giving me like a starry sky, which is beautiful. So I'm going to let this fully dry. before I show you the next step. Okay, so this is virtually dry, so I'm going to move on to the next step with you guys. I've cleaned my palette, as you can see. It was getting a little bit mucky, and the next step, I want a beautiful bright pink. So I didn't want a mucky palette, so clean water into your palette, and I'm going to go to my Permanent Rose, and we're going to do another technique, which is encouraging the paint to bleed and actually getting it to go in the right place. So I'm mixing up this lovely fresh pink. So you can see that there, it's nice and fluid. And what I'm going to do before I start to paint is use a largish brush in my number 8 round, clean water, and I want to wet the heart. So a bit like in painting 1, Valentine card number 1 we did the cling film technique. If you haven't watched that one, I'd recommend it. It's a really fun one to do. But we started out by wetting the entire area of the heart, which is exactly what we're doing here. So you want to control where you put this water. Try not to go over the edge now, because you don't want to spoil that lovely background you've just created. So just take your time. It's not a huge area, so although it will begin to dry, you should have time to get this done without getting any dry patches. So you don't want it too wet. So I'm going to take off the excess water and just go across the surface of the heart now and take off any patches of water or puddles that I can see. Let me show you how there's a sheen, but it's a soft sheen, so you don't want it too wet. So now what I'm going to do is take my number 4 brush into that pink and touch the edges of this heart, and it will want to move towards the centre. I think it started to dry a little bit on the edges, so I'm going to bring the paint in a little bit. Got the heating on, it's quite cold here in the UK, so that's going to affect how quickly my paper is drying, of course. So I'm going to go round just doing the edges. You can see here it's slightly wetter because it's dragging up into, it wants to move up into the heart, which is lovely. Okay, so now I've gone around the entire thing. I'm encouraging it to sort of begin to bleed into the centre. And then what I'm going to do now is go into, directly on the palette, my stronger paint, and touch the edges and allow that to blend into the paler pink that I've just put down. Remember, if you need to, you can move your paper around, turn it around, make it as easy as possible. But this is working quite nicely. You can also tilt the paper. So for example, at this bottom edge, if I want it to run, I can tilt the paper and encourage it to go in that direction. You can encourage it to come back that way, left and right. And that's what we should have so far. So it's very wet, the surface at the moment.